Thank you very much, Chris. That was fabulous. You did mention near the end there agents who won't return your calls.
Yes.
So maybe our next speaker should be an agent who will return our calls.
Very good.
How's it? How about it, Sam?
Is this on? So, actually, don't call me. Because I used to get my voicemails, and I would get these messages like, "Hi, I have this poetry collection. Do you know anything about copyrights?" And then I'm like, I don't even know how to respond to this. So I just tell people, email me, and that way I'll get to it eventually, and it's just so much more efficient. It's a great way to communicate with somebody like me who's overwhelmed most of the time. You get me it's great. I'm out of the office, all this stress of my staff asking me what's happening, and my clients wondering what I'm doing with their books. Clearly I'm working. You can see I'm sending it out right now. So in case they ever ask you. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of moments in an agent's life, because I feel like I probably should write a memoir at some point, but I don't think I'm big enough, or I don't have big enough writers yet, but someday. There are very few books about what it's like to be an agent, and so I'll give you a couple of moments in my life. So one is so for those of you who don't know me, maybe I should start with that, because I feel some of you know a little bit about me, and some of you probably know nothing. But I started off being such a fan of writing that I wanted to be involved in publishing, and I was too shy to try to get a job in publishing, because I thought, I don't really know anything, nobody's going to hire me. And I was reading an article about how the Paris Review started, and they basically said there were 4 guys that nobody would publish. They were in Paris together, and they said, let's start a magazine. And they said, nobody's going to read our magazine, so let's interview somebody famous so that we'll have a name. So they interviewed E.M. Forster. And of course, ever since then, the Paris Review has had an interview with somebody. Well, now they have many interviews. And they're probably the best interviews. Those of you who are interested in the craft and the kind of life of writing should read those. They've anthologized them into like 4 or 5 books now, where you can read Hemingway and Marquez, and they couldn't get Jane Austen, but I wish they could. They could channel it. But they have a bunch of writers, like hundreds of writers in there. So they started this magazine. So I was so inspired by it that I started a magazine with some friends, and I published a lot of people, and I had so much fun. And eventually I realized that I really liked it. I loved what I was doing. The Globe and Mail said it was the coolest magazine ever, and I needed some kind of external validation because my parents weren't going to do it. And so they were confused about what I was doing anyway. So then a bunch of other people came around me, and they said, you're so good at this, you should start a publishing company. And I'm like, I should? And I don't know if you guys know this, but the best line they tell publishers is, you know how to make a lot of money in publishing? You start off with a fortune. And then you're going to make a little bit of money out of it. Anyway, so I did that for a while. I published 60 beautiful little books that nobody bought. And I then got this crazy offer to be an agent for this really big speaking agent, the Lavin Agency. And the guy was such a great mentor to me, and he basically threw me out there, and he's like, Sam, guess what? I'm like, what? He's like, you got the salary. I'm like, that's more than a publishing salary. I'm not going to tell him that, though. And then he said, I have 2 million air miles, so if you want to go somewhere, just tell me. And I'm like, oh, I like that. So I went to the Frankfurt Book Fair, I went to London, I learned, I went to New York. I kind of, I was just kind of winging it. I was a fan of writers and, through the magazine and through books. But I was basically a failure. I considered myself, near the end of my publishing, my 10-year publishing career, I did 6 to 8 books a year. It was me and my friends and some freelancers that we paid. And near the end, the last 2 years, we got a book on the Globe and Mail 100, which when you consider how few books we were doing and how hard it was to get in there, we got a book every year. And I thought, if we could keep doing this, maybe we could figure out how to make money at it somehow. But it still wasn't really helping. And so when I started the agency, I left the company I was with, and I learned a lot. And then I was in a position that nobody wants to be in, which is having worked at a big agency and starting your own agency, nobody knows who you are. Before, when I worked at the Lavin Agency, people would look it up, and they'd see that he represented Norman Mailer and Margaret Atwood and all these people for their speaking. And we kind of got to ride on that because he also represented like Bob Geldof and Salman Rushdie. So they knew the names. They're like, oh, I should meet this guy. So everybody wanted to meet with me. But when it was just Sam Hiyate, and when you start, for those of you who's ever started a company, in the first couple of weeks, I was like, hi, it's Sam from the Rights Factory. Because it's kind of like it means nothing. You kind of made it up. Now, of course, we all say the Rights Factory and it means something. But back in the early days, I remember that, like, what does that really mean? But I was looking for talent, but I didn't have a lot to go with because we had like a little website with really nothing on it. And so one of my favorite writers was David Gilmour. And I don't know if you guys know him. He's got maybe 10 books out. And one of my friends, when I was a publisher, said, you should send this book to David Gilmour to Blurb because he'd really get it. So I sent him the book, and he said, he actually responded, and he said, look, I know this guy. We're drinking buddies. I like his book, but I don't like enough to blurb it. And he wrote me this long thing about why he liked the book, why he couldn't blurb it, and why I couldn't use any of his letter as a blurb. Because he knew that I would probably do that because he wrote it, So then I thought, okay, I like this guy, but he's kind of tough, So I was at a party. I used to go to a lot of parties. It's really how what developed my career. So I recommend it. For those of you who don't go enough parties, go to more. So I was at a party, and somebody said, and I saw David Gilmour. It was a book launch, I think. And so I went up to him, and I said, hey, I'm an agent. You remember years ago I sent you that thing? And he said, oh, yeah, I heard you were some kind of up-and-coming publishing guy. And I said, yeah, I gave up on that. I couldn't figure out how to make it work, but I'm an agent now. And who's your agent? And he said, oh, well, I have an agent who's retiring. And I said, oh, we should talk. And no response. So what I didn't know was later on, he was talking to all the big agents because he'd had this New York agent who'd retired, couldn't find anybody. And then, so about 3 or 4 months later, I went to, I can't remember what this event was, but it was in his neighborhood, I found out later. It was like 2 blocks away from his house. And he was there with his wife. And I said, David, it's me, Sam Hiyate from the Rights Factory, And he's like, oh, yeah. He's like, how's it going? And I said, hey, I never heard from you. We never got to, can we talk about agenting and your career? And he said, you know what? Let's do that. Let's make a lunch date. And we made a lunch date. And then he told me that in the 3 months since I first asked him what was going on, he'd met with all the major agents in Toronto, and they all said, you're kind of a failed mid-career white male writer. Yeah, we're not interested. So even though he was so talented, he wrote these beautiful sentences that I loved. And it was true, actually, because he'd never surpassed about, literary novels are tough unless you win an award or something. He never won an award. And he had never sold more than about 8,000 copies of a book. And so we had lunch, and then he said, I got to tell you, I'm not convinced about you. Like, who are your clients? And I'm like, I have a couple brand new writers. And he's like, see what I mean? Like, and you don't have this big agency behind you. So we had this chat. And then he said, at the same time, I got to tell you, I'm incredibly broke. And I said, okay, well, that's good. Maybe we can fix that. So he had a book coming out. And anyway, he actually signed with me because I convinced him somehow I was going to make him some money, but I didn't know how. So I went home and I'm like, how am I going to do this? This is the guy that I wanted to represent, and I love his books, his first 4 books that and here we are. So then I said, let's meet again, and I'll come up with some ideas. And he's like, okay, great. So meanwhile, he gave me the advanced galley of his new book, which was called A Perfect Night to Go to China. And I read it, and I said, okay, we can definitely help you with the foreign rights on this. It's going to be a great book. It reminded me a little bit of Haruki Murakami in that it was about longing. It had a very elusive ending, which I still don't get to this day, but I never told David that. Some things you have to withhold from your author if you're going to keep a relationship. Anyway, so I said, I think I can do something with this. He's like, okay, well, nobody else wants me. He's like, I'm so confused. Nobody else really loves me. Nobody wants me, but you do. And I forgot to say, the first lunch, I'd read all of his books. I quoted sentences to him, and he was blown away. He's like, you're like a fan. And it kind of appealed to his ego, I think. But anyway, he didn't say he was going to sign with me. So finally, we're working together now. And I said, look, David, like, these literary novels, how long do they take you to write? And he's like, 4 or 5 years. they kill me. It takes me 4 or 5 years. They're autobiographical. I write them out. I put my blood on the page, and then the reviews savage me, and then, it's just sad life. I don't even know why I did it. Became a writer. So I'm like, okay, well, why don't we try nonfiction? Because one of the things I'd learned is if you have a nonfiction a nonfiction idea for a book, you can sell it on the concept. You don't need the whole manuscript. Those of you that are not having a lot of luck with fiction because it's like 5 years being alone or 2 years being alone. In the case of Jennifer, it's like 30 days being alone. I'm so impressed. I'm so impressed by that. But for most everybody else, it's a long time. So I said, what about nonfiction? And he said, oh my God, this is perfect. I've always wanted to write a book about how to get over women. And I'm like, well, how many wives are you on now? Is this a good idea? And I said, you're not Dr. Phil. That's not a good idea. So then he's like, okay, what about a book about Tolstoy? And then I thought, a book about Tolstoy? There could be something there. He's a literary writer writing about another literary writer. And then I said, let's just talk more about it. So we kept going, I kept pushing, and then finally he said, oh, I know, I was going to save this for a novel. And I said, oh, that's good. And then he said, when my son was 15, I was living in downtown Toronto, and my ex-wife lived on the Danforth. I don't know if you guys know Toronto, but kind of a different neighborhood, not really downtown, kind of more neighborhoody. And our son lived in the basement apartment. And one day, we realized that he was failing school, and I kind of realized that I had to man up and be a good dad, so I ended up switching. I moved in with him, and my ex-wife moved into my kind of swinging downtown loft, and I stayed in this house with a backyard and a barbecue and everything. And I told my son, you're failing school, it's okay, we're going to take you out, and I'm going to spend time with you because I think you need a male figure in your life. Because he'd been kind of like this absent dad for a long time. And so he said, you may not remember this, but about 15 years ago, Gilmore had a TV show called Gilmore on the Arts where he interviewed people and reviewed films and stuff. And he said one of the things about his kid, it was that they shared this love of movies together. So he said to the kid, we're taking you out of school, you don't have to get a job, you can sleep until noon, you can do whatever you want, but you have to watch 3 movies a week with me. And it has to be serious. You can't just fall asleep. If it's a foreign film, you can't just abandon it. So the kid, he says, I want you to think about it. So the kid thinks about it. He's like, okay, Dad, I'll do it. I'm gonna watch movies with you. I'm not gonna go to school. And so David thinks it's gonna be like maybe 3 or 4 months, and then they can figure out what to do with school. It ends up going for 3 years. And during these 3 years, Jesse, the kid, he goes from being this kind of like juvenile delinquent, to getting a job, getting a girlfriend, and then I'm hearing this story and I'm saying, this is great, and then I kept thinking, what's the ending? A good story needs an ending, so I'm like, how does it end? He's like, oh, well, all of his friends were getting into university, so he wrote that, the 3-month test that SATs or something? GED, yeah, I think they're SATs in the States, but I think they're GEDs. So he wrote the GEDs, and he got like 90%, but he was so late, but he got waitlisted for University of Toronto. And I'm like, waitlisting, it doesn't even matter if he doesn't get in. If he gets waitlisted, that's a great ending. That's like a Disney ending to the story. And he actually did get in. We found out later. But so I said to David, what do you want to call it? And he said, the Film Club. So I thought about it, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna have to take a shot here. I'd never done this before. Remember, I'm a brand new agent. I was used to having people that were known for something for nonfiction, like this is the world's expert on this thing, they want to write this book about it, great, if publishers would respond. Here's a literary writer who's never written anything nonfiction-y before, wanting to write this memoir about him and his son. So I called up his publisher. Oh, and one little aside. In the meanwhile, his book had won the Governor General's Award for fiction. So all of a sudden, he wasn't as broke anymore, for one thing, but we had this great moment where I said, wait, now that you won this award, all the other agents called him, and they said, I made a mistake. I made a mistake, I should have signed you, I know what I was thinking. And then he said, yeah, no, sorry, I signed with Sam Hiyate, so, he took a chance on me. So he's incredibly loyal, which I really liked, because he could have, sometimes writers, it all depends on the kind of person you are, but not everybody stays with you for the same reason. Sometimes it's a bad fit, or they just feel like somebody bigger comes along, and then this has happened to me, and then I'm like, oh, I guess they weren't that loyal after all. But going back to this moment, I said, you just won the Governor General's Award. I'm going to call your editor. So I called the editor and I said, look, I don't have anything but a pitch, and I want to get an offer for the book. And the guy said, this is unusual. And he's basically thinking, where's this guy from? What agenting school did he graduate from? So I said, it's called The Film Club, and it's a story that I told you, and it takes 3 years of David's life. And then the editor's like, oh my God, that's amazing, and what a great story. And he's like, okay, so let me talk to my people. I said, oh no, there's more. And David had told me what his advance was for his last book, and so as a good agent, I doubled it. So I said, he needs this much money to do it. And so the guy, he listened, and he said, okay, I'll talk to my boss about that book. I think it's an interesting idea. On nothing but a pitch, right? Like just a pitch over the phone. And then he said, can you go down on the money? And I said, no, David and I are both broke. Like we're not going to be able to eat another couple of weeks until you send him a royalty check for the Governor General's Award winning book. And you, by the way, you get the authors that are published by big houses here. There's horror stories about how the publishers will keep the money for a long time, and you're like, where's that money? They made a sale. You guys know what I'm talking about. It can take a while for it to come, even though they're just sitting on it, but you're not getting it. So about a week later, they called and they said, we had a long meeting about it, and we decided against our better judgment to say yes to the money and to the book. And so I called David, and he was completely flabbergasted. He said, I thought we were just kind of, speaking hypothetically. Because now he realized it was a book that he had to write, and there was a contract. And he said, I thought you were going to say, let me pitch this as an idea, and you weren't going to be able to do it. And I said, thanks for that vote of confidence. So he'd never heard of this before. But then he said, you pitched it, and I think at one point he said, if you can pitch it without any materials, I'll write it. So the book came out, and I was traveling around the world. I was using the last of my savings, and I had this book by David Gilmour called The Film Club, and I got an editor in London to buy it. She actually told me what the book was. I love this editor. She said, this is the story of a relationship between a father and a son. And I'm like, the story of a relationship. Well, I'm not smart enough to have thought of that, but this was an editor with a lot of experience. She bought it right away. And by then we had some samples. And then I went to New York with it. It was a little tougher there. And then finally somebody said, this is a beautiful book. And we ended up having this weird bidding war because one editor loved it, and the other editor kept saying, I can just think about the marketing. We could just put the book out and have the Netflix list to watch with your kid, and it was all marketing for that person. So, and the money was, this is where there's a conflict of interest, just so you know, sometimes between a writer and the agent. Because I was thinking, if you go for these guys with the marketing plan, and agents get paid a commission, right? So I get 15%. And it was something like $150,000 they were thinking. So I'm like, that's $22,000 US for me, just for doing nothing. Not really doing nothing, but because I came up with the idea with him. But the other guy was about half as much, but he was a better known editor, and he actually had editorial ideas. He's like, this book, it's a little flawed. You need to do this. And he wrote a long letter. And then and because he knew that he couldn't go past a certain amount, and these other guys were offering more. So the clock was ticking, and I called David, and I said, can we go with the people with the money so that we can get paid on this? And he's like, Sam, I'm going to overrule you on this. This editor is really brilliant. I want to go with that. So I got half the commission that I would have gotten. But it really didn't matter, because after that, I went around the world, sold the book in 29 languages, which nobody ever expected. And so get this, in Germany, it sold 600,000 copies. It sold in Canada about 15,000. It sold about 75,000 in the US. But in Germany, it sold about 100,000 in Brazil, which nobody understands. David bought a house in Kensington Market, a beautiful Victorian house with the money. I was able to go for another 2 years with my commission. But the interesting thing about this was, it was never that big here. And I kept going back to the German publisher, and I said, what happened? Nobody knew who he was before. And the German publisher said, you know how you guys in North America have those book clubs? And I'm like, yeah, it's the biggest market. He's like, it is here too. So what happened was, every major book club in Germany bought this book for all their members, because they were these women it's 90% of the membership of these book clubs are women, right? So he said all these mothers bought the book to give to their husbands so they could be more involved in their kids' lives as a kind of inspirational story. So David, without even knowing what the story was the fact that he actually did something courageous, that he gave up a lot of stuff to spend 24/7 with his kid. And there are some dark moments there where they have fights and stuff, and he was incredibly honest about it. And anyway, so the weird thing about, that's one story. I have 10 of those. So get me later and get me to tell you one. But my main goal is, I can't always do that. I can't always change somebody's life like that, to go from his biggest book being, it ended up being Perfect Night to Go to China, which ended up selling, I think, 12,000 copies or whatever. But and that got 3 or 4 translation licenses. But to go from there to like 800 or 900,000, we'll probably get to 1 million in another couple of years, because the books keep selling, and it's kind of interesting. But sometimes when you come up with an idea to make money, you don't know what you're doing. I didn't realize that it was a book to inspire men to be a better father. So there's one story for you. It has a happy ending and a lot of money. So and the other part is that there was a huge film deal. It was so big in Germany that the biggest publisher in Germany paid him 6 figures for the film rights. So on top of all this other money, there was a huge film deal. And they were going to change it to all the German films, because instead of all the, like, he had Hitchcock and all these other films, you can't get access to those films. If you call up whoever owns the rights and you say, we need like 5 seconds of Hitchcock to show in this movie, they're going to say, yeah, it's $2 million. So they had to rewrite the story to be the German kind of film canon. And then David had to watch these movies. They paid him, I think it was like $10,000 to watch German movies, because his film agent, his separate film agent who negotiated all this, I'm like, that's an amazing amount. He's like, yeah, but I'm not sure I like German movies that much anymore. But he had to watch them all to see if he agreed with their choices for how the kid would respond, right? Anyway, so that's my story.